G'day everyone, welcome to Rule of Reason, and I've got a new guest today, Dan Paterson. I'm very excited for this conversation because, as you all know, my heart is for meaning and for truth and for purpose in people's lives, and I think Questioning Christianity, which is the organization that Dan runs, is on the same path. And so with that in mind, I think you'll get a lot out of today's episode, and let's just jump straight in. Dan, thank you for being here today.
Hey, great to be with you, Zach.
For anyone who doesn't know you, doesn't know Questioning Christianity, could you explain a little bit about both?
Yes, would love to. So I was born in Melbourne, and so AFL runs thick in my blood. For anyone outside of Australia, that's Aussie rules football. It's one of the greatest games will be played in the new creation, I'm sure. Game of the Gods. And moved up to Brisbane when I was 5 and lived here roughly ever since. So I'm married to my wife, Erin. We're 16 years in now, and we've got 3 boys, sort of 11, 8, and 6 at this point in time. So they're playing AFL, lots of sports, lots of computer games, lots of wrestling with big questions, and playing in the pool. So I mostly have to try and keep them alive. It's a bit of a full-time gig. My background is as a pastor and theologian. I teach at seminary. I've been involved with churches, but for the last 10 or so years, I've mostly been helping people wrestle with the biggest questions that they have when it comes to the God stuff. And so working through doubts, understanding the Bible and history and the big questions of God's existence, science, and whether or not we can really believe in this guy Jesus, working through the objections that are really common that people might have. And so an area people might call apologetics, or giving an answer for the hope that lies within us. And so Questioning Christianity was set up to do that. We do talks in schools and churches and public events and university forums, and then we make a bunch of online content right across social media platforms, particularly on YouTube, helping people wrestle with those sorts of questions. Just so I don't get too bored reading books and being inside and making content and writing and reading, I catch snakes on the side. So run a little gig called Eden Snake Catchers just to help keep up the adrenaline.
For someone going into apologetics, Christian apologetics, as you briefly touched on, apologetics can be broken down into how the word came about, but effectively it's defending Christianity. There's probably a lot of people who think, surely when he was young, he didn't think, when I grow up, I want to be an apologist. How did that come about?
That's a great question. If you'd come and done this interview when I was 17, like my greatest fear in life was public speaking. I remember doing my year 12 English examination for sort of an oral exam, and we had to do this 7-minute speech perfectly timed. And I'd practiced it at home and nailed it, but being in front of people, I just got so nervous. And so I remember delivering this speech in under 4 minutes. Like I was that fast, just motored my way through. And at the end, my white business shirt was just sweated through. My face was red, and people didn't know whether to clap or call an ambulance. Like it was wild. And so certainly not what I expected to be doing later in life. And even when I was finishing up high school, I didn't really know what I thought about the God stuff. We'd had a big car accident in my family's story. I grew up going to church with mum and dad. But when I was 9, a big car accident where on family holiday, mum ended up with significant brain damage from headbutting a semi-trailer at high speed. And that kind of just torpedoed my childlike belief in God. It was hard for me to think about, hey, if God's real and if he really cares about us, if he could stop stuff like that happening, he's powerful enough, why he wouldn't step in and have saved us from that. I mean, Christians have been awesome through that whole experience. Their meals dropped off at our house for months on end every afternoon, just of the church looking after my family through that. But I think that sort of just gave me a backward step to the God stuff. So I started a science IT dual degree at university, did 2 weeks in first computer labs, and said I don't want to be a programmer. Most people would be looking at that now and saying, wow, you'd be really rich if you were a programmer. You chose a dumb career path. But it was actually that first year out of uni that I ended up becoming a Christian. And so exploring big questions about purpose and meaning. And I'd seen the fragility of life and how we don't necessarily know our tomorrows. And so it just gave me this sense of, hey, I want to make sure that whatever I choose to do matters. And if I do look back from my deathbed, I'll know that I've poured myself into the most important things. And it was really that search that led to a mate putting a Bible in my hands and saying, hey, I think you should wrestle with this yourself. Read it now that you're a bit older and can kind of wrestle with its claims. And it was through reading the gospel stories about Jesus that I ended up coming to faith in the gospel. And that it really is good news, whether you're searching for meaning stuff or trying to make sense of suffering, and whether God's there, whether he cares, whether you're thinking eternally and life beyond this time here on earth. It just, for me, rang true. I found Jesus extraordinarily compelling. And so I don't think apologetics really, for me, is about philosophy or science in the abstract. It's really about, I've come to see a story that makes sense of life, and one who I've found really is trustworthy. You can believe him. And in doing so, just talking about that, working through the Christian story, the Bible, and if it has answers to these big objections and questions. And so a lot of people look at apologetics and say, man, that's just lying for Jesus, or it's marketing for God, or it's, you shouldn't need to have people defending him as though QCs or KCs or King's Council or whatever. But for me, it's just, no, I just want to draw out of the Bible the riches that I've found for how it speaks to life's deepest questions, and how it does make sense of a lot of the objections that people have, and allow them to kind of come to their own wrestling with God too. So glad to be doing it.
You, in your introduction, you touched on questioning Christianity helps people with their doubts. It's interesting because based on what you've just told us with your own personal family story and how you said we have an all-powerful God who could prevent that from happening. And you often hear that as one of the main objections. Well, why would a good and gracious God allow enter tragedy here, right? You've experienced in your life, and yet you still believe it to be true. Since having that moment when you were a teenager or a bit older, became a Christian, have you had any doubts since then? For anyone who listening, it's great for him to tell people, not to have doubts because he doesn't have any doubts. Yeah. Have you had doubts?
Yeah, well, we actually say the exact opposite. We say doubts are a really good thing, because doubts can be a doorway through which you dig into the Christian story. It's like, hey, wait, this doesn't make sense to me. And you end up having to go and investigate. And so one of our taglines with the ministry is that truth invites questioning. If the story really is robust, if it really is true, you should be able to dig away and ask away, and end up feeling like there's more credibility and weight to this than before I started investigating. It may not exhaustively answer every question, but there's enough for me really to believe that God's real, that he does care. Certainly, I think doubts are a big part of how I've developed. And I often use the analogy of like a tree. It's the wind, it's the resistance that pushes against a small sapling, causes breaks in the fibers in the tree that allow it to grow up stronger. It actually requires that stress, kind of like our muscle fibers, You have to break the micro tears in order for it to grow back stronger and bigger and in greater mass. And so I think faith works in the same way. You have to experience doubts, and whether they're ones that are brought on by intellectual questions, maybe a science communicator on YouTube raises a great question, or TikTok you have no idea how to answer, or a ex-Christian or someone who's deconstructed sort of shares their experience. You're like, oh, I don't know how to respond to that. Or if it's the tragedies and maybe unfulfilled longings you have in your own life that are like, God, this isn't exactly what I expected a relationship with an all-powerful, all-loving God to be like, and you end up just wondering, man, is this true? I've had plenty of those experiences over the last 2 decades. I wouldn't say I've ever had doubts to the point of thinking this isn't real. I've just had questions of, I know in whom I believe. I know the foundations of the Christian story, particularly of the life of Jesus, his death, his resurrection. I'm persuaded that the evidence really does point towards the resurrection of Jesus. And because of that, I have to wrestle with God. It's not wrestling with life. Do I want God in it or not? It's like I'm trying to wrestle with God in making sense of life. And I think that's the gift of Christian lament. Lament is getting angry with God. You're wrestling with God in the pain and suffering and confusion that you're wandering through, rather than running away from him. You're running to him, but with questions, with the full gamut of your human emotions. And I've never, I think, been tipped to the point of thinking, I don't think Christianity has explanatory resources anymore. I'm like, no, I think the Christian story makes the most sense of all of the available options. And there's no one I'd rather follow than the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And I've experienced him, and I've experienced the absences of him and unanswered prayers. But it's those moments of seeing who he is and how he's worked in history that give me the trust that even from the shadows or in moments of silence, he's still at work, just maybe not in the ways that I would expect.
I've got so many different questions just from that I want to ask you. I'm just trying to think what's the best way. But what I might do before I sort of dive into more theological style questions, which you're going to be more positioned to answer than I can. How did questioning Christianity come about? What was you said you went to university and coding was not for you, or programming was not for you.
Mm.
So what was the
The steps
path?
from there, yeah. So I'd already been working a sort of afternoon and weekend job during high school in a pool shop, and just picked up a full-time gig then when I dropped out of uni. And it was that first year out where I'm working full-time, become a Christian, and next year I kind of switched. I'm like, all right, well, let me dig into this and see whether my Christian faith is going to give me more direction. What could I study? And I did pretty well at school. So the options are open for you. You've got, what do you want to do? But I remember coming to the point of thinking, you know what, I'm actually most interested in studying the Bible and history and thinking through these rich theological questions. And I had a number of people at our church, even within 12 months of becoming a Christian, who were tapping me on the shoulder and saying, look, we think you should maybe get some training in seminary to be able to get prepared for gospel ministry. And that was, again, a terrifying prospect, speaking publicly, but I'm like, all right, I'm willing to give it a crack. And so I think when I was 18, I applied for doing a Bible college degree, so my bachelor's degree in theology, and kind of wandered through there and loved it and did well and became an academic tutor at the college, and then stuck around to do a master's degree right when I started pastoring as well, and did some foot within the college and some foot within pastoral ministry for about 6 or 7 years. Partway through that, had the chance to go and do just a certificate degree over at Oxford University. And that was like a special program designed in apologetics and theology, studying with guys like John Lennox and Alistair McGrath were sort of our weekly tutors. Os Guinness became a big ministry mentor to me, and he was over for a number of subjects that he ran us through, and just a bunch of the sort of theologians and philosophers within the Oxford faculty itself, who we got to learn from. And that was a super rich year. And that was really, I guess, my baptism into more apologetics, and not apologetics for its own sake, but to help give people reasons to believe. And it was commending as well as defending the gospel. Paul in Philippians chapter 1 talks about being in chains for commending and defending the gospel. And that was really it, on the front foot, giving people reasons to think that the Christian story actually is worth taking seriously, as well as then helping them work through their doubts and objections. And that was a transformative experience for me. I ended up after that working with an international mob called RZIM, or Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. So they said, look, will you come move to America? And I'm like, I'm actually only on study leave from my church gig. They're expecting me to come back. We feel like that's our heart there, and we want to serve well and do that faithfully. And my wife, Erin, was actually pregnant at the time, sadly, with a child that we lost. But in sort of the calculus of what do we do next, moved back to Australia, and then they changed and said, well, would you open an Australian branch for us then? And so that was kind of new territory, starting out a new family. We lost a couple of kids, sadly, to miscarriage. But then our first son came along sort of in 2015. And that was right when I started with RZIM, launching the Australian branch. And that was similar to what I'm doing now in terms of speaking, not so much the online stuff or digital content, but very much speaking in universities and churches and schools and public events and forums. And that was fascinating all around the world, mostly in the Asia Pacific team, but a bit in the UK, a bit in America as well. So that was fun. But kind of got to the point where in beginning of 2020, sort of 5 years on, COVID was looming, and there was reports, and I was up in Singapore and had made the decision to step down from RZIM, and came back, and it was like, all right, lockdown. No one's going anywhere. And it was amazing to see how everything just shifted sideways, from churches to public talks. Everyone's just doing Zoom meetings and online gigs. All of a sudden, I'm like, you know what? This actually has the capacity to reach way more people than what I'd thought about before, and be able to have conversations with friends overseas that I wouldn't be able to organize in person anymore. And so it was really in that year, 2020, that we started thinking about launching Questioning Christianity. And ended up doing that the year after to help people think online and reach out to where young people are mostly Googling and YouTubing and TikToking their questions before they ask them in person. And so I'm like, man, what a great medium to be able to connect with people as well as keep up the in-person stuff. And so that's a bit of our origin story.
It's a wonderful story. What is the toughest question? If you can think off the top of your head, what's the toughest question someone's thrown your way? We've gone,
Yeah.
I don't know if I can answer this one.
Yeah. I just quickly coming back to that online space. One thing I've really noticed is people are struggling to know who to listen to, as well, because it's not just information. There's a degree of synthesis. How do you bring together all the disparate ideas, thoughts, data points into a story that makes sense of it? And is that one that's going to animate life? And who do I follow? How do I live? What am I aiming for? All of those sorts of questions. And I found the online place to be a minefield for that reason, in that there are so many voices and things coming at you, but you're always asking the question, who do we trust? Can we trust this source? Is this fake news? Is that a propaganda to try and discredit good news? You're really having to kind of navigate that space and just trying to not only show people how to engage with the ideas, but also who to be in the midst of that engagement, and to not lose either our humanity or, in my case, a higher calling to represent the image of God and the character of Jesus. And so to give people what genuinely is a light in an otherwise pretty dark space is certainly part of my goal. But in terms of like the hard questions, and whatever is the question you're being asked in the moment, that's the hard one. I think most people have this feeling of being blindsided in a conversation by a question they just weren't expecting, and therefore feel really ill-equipped to answer. I mean, I certainly remember one in a forum where I had a bunch of my heroes sitting in the audience, and so like John Lennox and Oz Guinness and Amy Orr Ewing and others. And I was asked a very complex ethical question, and it was about the kind of pro-life, pro-choice conversation. But a guy got up to the mic, and he'd been vetted by, they're always checking the questions to make sure that they're suitable for public consumption. And we're not afraid of any question, just want to make sure that people don't share things that probably shouldn't be shared. But this guy ended up sharing something that probably shouldn't have been shared, because he shared his sister's story and sort of threw her under the bus by saying that, her and her husband had been pregnant. 20-week scan went in and found severe abnormalities in the formation of the child, and the baby was going to, prognosis-wise, have a shortened lifespan and one with a lot of suffering. And they reasoned that the suffering might cause the child to grow up and hate God, and because of that, end up rejecting him and be lost for eternity. And so they thought it better, given the idea that babies that are lost before an age of accountability probably go to heaven, to instead kill the child and ensure that their baby will go to heaven. And so they did that last week. What do you think? So that's the question that's kind of asked in public. And there's just so many layers to something like that. There's deep pastoral pain, and just lament of the situation that they were thrust into, and just the hurt of trying to make these sorts of decisions. There's a question of ethical reasoning, actually following it through, and is a life of suffering not a life worth living? And is not the richest stories that we've heard lives that have come and faith in God in the midst of suffering? And certainly that's been a big part of my own experience. And the way that the Christian story offers hope and meaning, and a God who has scars and suffers with us. But also just questions of who has the right to life and death, and do we take that God power upon ourselves, and what is the status of a human being made in the image of God? And so that was just so complex to then be asked in a public forum as like a 26-year-old at the time, that'd probably be more on the tricky side. But in terms of the actual theologically complex and deep questions, it's usually the sort of problem of evil. Why would a good God let bad things happen? Or a corollary question, one sort of sideline to that, which is growing in terms of its popularity, but sort of the hiddenness of God. If God really wants us to believe in him, why doesn't he make himself more believable? Why is he so hidden from so many of us so much of the time? And so that sort of sense that some skeptics or atheists might have of saying, look, I want to believe in God, I want to be a Christian, but I'm just not persuaded by the evidence. And God, being all-knowing, would know what it would require for me to believe, but yet he withholds that light, and therefore I'm unable. Surely that means he doesn't really love me enough to want to have a relationship with me. And so it's those sorts of questions, I think, that really are the sort of thorny ones that people wrestle with. And a close third would be questions around judgment and hell and final justice. In the end, will the judge of all the earth do what is right? Those tend to be the ones that come up again and again.
And it's hard with those sorts of questions as well, because the question is framed with a worldly mindset. As you've briefly touched on, tragedy or what is a good life. The world sells the story, especially in a materialistic world, that having wealth, having freedom, having safety. They're the things that provide a good life. But we sort of, as Christians, know that's not necessarily the recipe to a quote unquote good life. And I was doing a bit of reading the other day, and they were touching on Mother Teresa's life and how she always took shoes last. That's why she had deformed feet, and she always, if she had anything, gave it to someone else because there was so much need. And so she lived her entire life of having nothing for herself in order to help other people. And people say, well, did she live a good life? Yes, she's honored now as Mother Teresa, and people would say she's the best person that ever lived, arguably. But
second to Jesus.
human, not God. And but people would say, yeah, but her life was, I would hate to have that life. So the question then stands, well, what constitutes a good life? So it also comes from the framing of when people say, well, why would God allow that? It's like, you've got the people asking the questions don't even understand the motivations underneath the questions they're asking you. And so I can imagine that must be a challenge for you, understanding hopefully firstly what they're asking, but secondly what's motivating them behind the question that maybe they don't even realize. And so having to break that down in a way that going, I'm answering your question, but what you actually need me to do is answer this that you don't even realize you've just asked me.
And you see Jesus playing this out in the Gospels a lot, slowly reframing people's understanding of life and of meaning and of their ultimate goal of soul formation. What kind of person are you? And so he'll say things like, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul? And at the time of this recording, just this week, the founder of OnlyFans died. 43 years old, earned $6.5 billion company in the end. But it's like what Jesus warned. You're building barns with bigger barns and tearing down those barns to build bigger barns because of the great bounty coming in. But you fool, this night will your life be demanded of you. And you end up standing before him on Judgment Day, having sold darkness and debauchery your whole life, thinking it's going to reap benefits that you never got to really taste. And even if you do taste them, I love Oscar Wilde's depiction of the picture of Dorian Gray. And it's sort of this dive into, okay, well, let's give hedonism its run. Let's give this just hard materialism, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But what if we don't die? And that's the Dorian Gray picture. He has this cursed portrait of himself that all the scars of his dark life, so all the sinful decisions, all the sexual perversions, everything that he chases, all of those scars are visited on the portrait rather than on his body, and he stays eternally youthful. But eventually he just can't stand to look at the portrait anymore, and he sees on the inside what he's becoming. And he runs out night after night chasing these desires only to find that he's wearied by them and they become empty and meaningless. And that's just such a common, it's almost seems like a trope now for the number of high-profile celebrities that come out and say as much, or sports stars who reach the height of their career. They achieve the thing they were chasing and then go, oh, that's it? I thought this would be different. I thought I'd be different at the end of all of this. And I think what Jesus does in the Gospels, what the whole Christian story is aiming for, is realizing actually it's God that will make you eternally happy. And it's a soul that's formed to be more like him. And that going through periods of suffering actually open the door for you to share in the fellowship of Christ's sufferings and to learn compassion and depth and have just some of these material goods stripped away from you to realize actually that's not it. That's not the answer to the deeper hungers of life. And sometimes that can be a degree of mercy or kindness. And there's a diagnosis where Jesus gives in the book of Revelation where he writes these sort of 7 report cards to 7 churches, and 5 of them get some pretty harsh words from Jesus. 2 of them get nothing but encouragement. But to one of them, the church in Ephesus, they say that they are rich and have need of nothing. That's their belief about themselves. Like, no, we're good, we're solid. And it was this historical boast this church had. The city was able to rebuild itself after a great earthquake without needing to appeal to resources from Rome or from surrounding cities. They were rich enough with the banking clans to rebuild on their own steam. And so they had this sense of self-sufficiency and satisfaction in material things. But Jesus' diagnosis is, you say you are rich and have need of nothing, but I say that you are poor, blind, pitiful, and naked. And just his assessment of them spiritually, and when it comes to the deeper meaning of reality, it's like, no, you're broke. You're genuinely broke. and just the awakening that the Christian story can bring for people on that. This feels good in the moment. It makes me happy for a second. Look, who wouldn't want to have more money? But then the people with money say, you know what, we have more money and you just have different problems, right? It's not that problems go away. They just morph into something else. And there are dangers at the door with the love of money as well. And so, yeah, I do find the Christian story has better answers. It is a better story when it comes to the meaning and the suffering and the hope and just charting a way to become someone that when you put your head down on the pillow at night, you're like, that was a day where I poured into things that mattered, and I'm thankful to God for that, and I feel closer to Him due to it. And I think that's what Mother Teresa would have tasted in the end.
This is going to sound like a strange segue, but when I was young, I believed, as it says in the Bible, that the devil is like a roaring lion that comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
Mm.
And in movies, in art, we see the devil as this horny.
Meaning with horns.
Horns and hooves and flames and pitchfork and, and I believe, why would anyone give into that? That's not attractive at all.
Mm.
But as I've gotten older, I've realized if the devil is as cunning as the Bible describes him to be, he would be attractive. How does the devil defeat Christians if they know what his game plan is?
Mm.
And the trick is you just keep them distracted.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the Apostle Paul encourages Christians is to not be unaware of his schemes. And I think for the most part, we are unaware of his schemes. I'll never forget, I reckon I was 21 or 22 reading the Screw Tape Letters for the first time, which is a series of fictional conversations that C.S. Lewis composed as a letter from a senior demon, Uncle Screwtape, to his dear nephew, Wormwood. And in this picture, in the same way that people sometimes conceive of guardian angels, there are demons that are assigned to try and lead every individual person astray. And so Screwtape is mentoring Wormwood on how to lead this young patient astray. And it's fascinating because you sort of see the psychology of the whole thing. And Screwtape refers to God as the enemy, and just set against God's plans and will for everyone's life. He doesn't want them to enjoy God forever and to glorify Him in this life. And it's fascinating just seeing the techniques that C.S. Lewis, I just think he had such a rich grasp of human psychology and the motivations that are sort of deep waters within us, that it was just the subtle ways. When he goes for a walk, make sure he goes for a walk, not for the enjoyment of the walk in itself, but because he needs to get fit. And so just twisting the motivations a little bit just keeps a person from being able to enjoy the things that would lead them more towards God and the good. And it was for me just a wake-up call on thinking, yes, the motivations of my own heart can be murky and twisted, but just recognizing who God is and what His purposes and plans are for us. Satan doesn't show himself say, hey, I'm Satan, come and follow me, right? It's too obvious. But in the way that he tempted Jesus, he kind of tempts us with the same kinds of things. It's like, here's all the kingdoms of the world, why don't you come and take them? And without us realizing that in doing so often we end up bowing down to Him and abandoning following God and His ways. We choose what is the created thing rather than the creator, or the worse rather than the better. And there's just subtle ways in which that happens in our culture right now. Most of us are numbed into it, numbing of our conscience inch by inch in evil and what we consume and what we do, and then a shifting of our desires away from the good of our neighbor and the eternal good of our soul to the material goods of this life as the thing that will fulfill us. Just having a moment to consider that and just wake up and say, what am I chasing? What do we really want? And if you could dig into your heart, you're like, okay, that's a good litmus test on how much the evil one's fingers have enclosed around us.
It seems to me that the way, the straight, narrow path are the basics that we've known for a long time. But because we're bombarded, especially since the creation of social media, with so much distraction, so much noise, and as you said earlier, it's hard to differentiate what is true and what is not. And so people are so sort of spending so much time trying to navigate the noise that they just miss the simplicity of just being still and quiet in God's presence and I know for me personally, because there's so much that goes on in your head now because of all the things you've seen in the day, the time it takes to quiet your mind, to get the distractions out of your head, it takes longer and longer the more that you've scrolled or whatever it is that you're doing.
Dopamine addiction is a real thing.
It's a real, it is
just,
a real
just learning
thing.
with technology, which is such a gift, and these are the fruits of Christian civilization, of wanting to study creation. We're given minds patterned after God's own mind. Science is a Christian gift to the world, historically speaking. And yet we also need to recognize that when we create tools, they often have within themselves the seeds of our destruction if used incorrectly. And I just find we're entirely captive to the entertainment culture, to the dopamine addiction, and we talked about the distortion of your motivations. It's like, yep, I get up at 5 a.m. most mornings and go to the gym. My goal should be to have a healthy body, to glorify God and enjoy my family, right? And serve his purposes in the world. How easily that motivation gets twisted to, I don't want to be a dad bod 40-year-old at the end of the year when I cross over that threshold. It's like, no, I want to stay fit. I want to have people feel like, oh, he's doing pretty well,
Yeah.
And just the subtle ways, same action, getting up, going to the gym, but just ways that can be distorted, just being aware of it. And it happens so much through the technology that we consume. It's discipling our desires in ways that we're usually unfamiliar with. It's just shaping what we're chasing.
So what are some skills then that you would arm young people in particular, because they have actually grown up with these technologies?
Yeah.
We're the same age or similar, and so these were invented as we were already teenagers. So we've had a chance to sort of...
Dude, we got to hold a phone that had a cord attached to it, and we got to dial up and hear the sounds of dial-up speed, and we got to have flip phones. Remember that fun stage? And the Nokia 3310, just the undefeatable brick that will outlast our civilization if it ever was to be doomed. But yeah, I mean, we've been through all of this. We probably still are way more addicted to it than we think, and we like to. Oh yeah, we've got some protection against it, but not as much. And I think because of the quality of research that's come out by some guys I respect in the kind of secular space, people like Jonathan Haidt and his work on moral foundations theory, particularly on technology and how it's affecting teenagers, it's driven much of the shift in the laws here in Australia, sort of his research into this, and some other friends that work in that space in psychology, even locally here in Brisbane. It's been cool. I think kids may be better off in my generation of kids, so 11, 8, 6, parents are getting much more strict in rules around technology use. But for, some of my teenage nephews and niece, they were at a time where it's just so much more difficult to have put those boundaries around it all. So I do think we're going to see generational shift in this, maybe hopefully learn some things. But I mean, in terms of like strategies around it, I do just think like, hey, what are the things that master me? That rather than me ruling over them, they've actually taken my heart and my life captive, and finding ways to stop that. I've got a bunch of friends who have just said, I take social media fasts, or there are certain apps that I've just deleted from my phone because it became way too easy to scroll away for hours on end, or to feel like I'm driven to my phone just to do that and ignoring the people right in front of me. So my kids are chatting to me and I'm just on my phone all the time doing things. Like great wake-up call, or the moments where your kid will say to you, Dad, can you put your phone down? And you're like, oh, and it's hard. Like so much of my work happens through that medium, but yet too, when they're in the room with you, to be able to say, this is not now a work time, and separate out that space. Can't exactly control when people call with a snake in their house, but for the most part, there's things that you can do where it's like, what are the healthy boundaries I set around my life when it comes to technology? I think there are some really good checklists too, just to be able to look at your own motivations, to go through the bits of your life and say, why am I doing the things that am I doing, and what am I neglecting that is the better option? When people say to me, I don't have time to do X, that's just not true. We have the time. It's a question of whether we prioritize the things that matter the most. And I just think making hard decisions to cut out of our lives stuff that isn't actually adding the value that we think it is. Oh, this is how I relax. Is it? Or is that just how you feed the dopamine addiction that your brain is telling you that you need?
It's literally what Craig Groeschel said on Sunday.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I was watching it on YouTube. Sorry, bit of a side shout at Craig Groeschel. He was talking about you have time for the things that you value. And if you were to go on your screen time and look at what you spend your time on, if you were to remove that, there's like 2 hours. great. Now you can do that thing.
Yeah.
It just depends on what's important to you.
Totally. Yeah.
Bringing questioning Christianity into it, right? So I agree with you 100%. Limits on screen time, but not so much that your kids are illiterate with technology. Is sort of the challenge that our generation parents, for our kids, my kids are the same age as yours, will need to do to allow them to have control over that dopamine addiction. But there are going to be plenty of kids that don't have that. They just, here's an iPad, spend some time with you.
Totally.
Is that where something like questioning Christianity can come in and go, well, hey, look,
Certainly.
if you're on the platform, then at least what you're going to view needs to be good.
I mean, we wrestle with this, even just the morality of getting on TikTok, because, I mean, by nature, algorithms are predatory. They're always trying to keep your attention and focus, and that's why the medium of videos has changed. Everything's moved to shorter reels. They've expanded that out. It's more than 60 seconds now. It's 3 minutes on most of the platforms for their short-form content, but it's still shorter than it used to be, and that's all to help keep your attention. TikTok I found particularly pernicious in terms of what it was trying to do to Western civilization in just distracting with stupidity. And so I wrestle with, should we get on there? But in the end, that was the concern. Well, young people are already on there. This is their marketplace of ideas. Do we exit the space and not allow truth to be proclaimed? So certainly there's things we can do in terms of guarding the vices of technology use, but there's also the development of positive virtue. And this is a whole lot of other rhythms, behaviors, things that I would want to encourage people to do positively. But on technology use, my encouragement would be find 10, 20, 30 creators. And it's an interesting word that we use for social media personalities, but creators whose content you think adds value. And it could just be through humor. Some of them do it brilliantly. It could be through different forms that maybe you're a little bit more uncomfortable with. And so a number of creators use a fair bit of skit and sarcasm and sometimes even polemic, which some Christians just find, it's not exactly the tone that I'm used to. Or just really good quality diagnosis and help people think through responses. So the response video stuff that we do, we'll take a video that pops up on TikTok, 20, 30, 40 seconds of it, and then just genuinely respond. And it's not meant to be a clap back. It's not meant to be bitey or respond like with like, but actually to model how I hope a Jesus follower might respond to that question. Great question. Let's wrestle with the ideas. Here's some of the faulty thinking. Here's maybe something you haven't considered before. Here's how the Christian story offers more than maybe what you've been exposed to, and invite real dialogue rather than just shutting everyone down into their silos or echo chambers. So find creators who are responding in a way that you think is helpful. And my hope for Christian kids growing up is that they're going to be exposed to the challenges to their faith from Christian voices before they'll ever hear them from atheist figurehead or a smart science communicator or someone who goes on Joe Rogan, that they'll actually get to hear them. This is one of the questions I've wrestled with. Just so you know, here's some of the ways you can think about it. And here are the options that Christians have in wrestling with that. I just think that development of how to think and how to be open and curious rather than just dogmatic, closed, hard-hearted, and like everything's a fight to the mat. Just how to say, you know what, I'm not worried that you're intellectually curious or digging around with other beliefs or hearing objections to Christianity. I think Christianity has the goods. I'm not afraid of that story being questioned, but here's how you can go about it in a helpful way.
I think that's really important. I think whether you like TikTok or any social media platform or not doesn't change the fact that it exists.
Correct.
And so if young people are going to be using it, there needs to be light in that darkness.
I mean, there's books that we recommend. You go to a pastor and say, I'm thinking about this topic. What book would you recommend? There aren't many young people that are buying and reading whole books, particularly not hard copy ones. Like that was my experience. That was what I grew up through. But most young people will be watching content, listening to podcasts. And it's like, who can I send them to who are going to be the trusted voices in that space that we can help them develop a relationship with? And then usually it's not one. I rarely say this is the perfect book that will answer all your questions. I'm usually like, here's a few people that will have different angles on this that you might find helpful in your development. And so I find channels are the same.
Especially if someone's on a path and they're looking at a particular area in their life. You can't just stick on one topic and go, this is what we're handing for the next month, right? So you'll address that and you'll move on, but that person's still in that space. So you might need 5 different creators who will periodically touch on that thing. So you get lots of different perspectives on that one topic.
Correct.
And that's the case for any creator. You and I are obviously hoping to be some sort of content creator that people watch and listen and hopefully gain something from, value add. I'm not in this to go viral. I don't want rage bait or whatever. But what I hope is that there's some sort of wisdom gleaned from these conversations that people can go, that was really good. And I think in regards to what you're doing, especially with those response videos, because there are lots of people, the one on the front of my mind is always Alex O'Connor, because he's very articulate, makes a very good argument, and you've done a couple of response videos to him. What would you say, because of all of the things that people do see on social media that you respond to, is one of the most common things about Christianity that is misunderstood, that people seem to get wrong, but it's used as a well-articulated argument?
It's a good question. I think there are concerns about understanding the Bible's story, in that I don't think Alex falls into this camp. I think he's got a much more nuanced and careful read, and he's done theology study at Oxford. But many people read the Bible and almost treat it as though it's a flat book with rules that are dropped out of heaven as the perfect expression of God's moral vision for human beings at all times and places everywhere. And things like the moral argument that we think the existence of God best grounds our intuition that something's wrong, best grounds the concept of objective moral values and duties, that there really is a good to which we should be aiming. That doesn't take away from situational reasoning, which is what Scripture so often engages in. Given the parameters of this situation, what's the best option right now? Not just what's the lesser of two evils, which I think is a lower form of this, but what is the greatest good in this possible scenario given the cultural and resource limitations? And I think that's a lot of what we see within the Old Testament covenant, for instance, is sort of case law playing out within the Torah of, right, we find ourselves in a fallen world between Genesis 3 and Revelation 20. The bookends of Scripture, Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 2, well, those are God's will done on earth as in heaven. That's where God's perfect will plays out. But between those bookends, then, we're in a fallen story where our cultures are far from the ideal of what God would have, of what it means to love God and neighbor, and that there are cultural limitations then placed on trying to move this human project forward. And so you've got a scenario where something terrible has happened. What is the best possible outcome here? Well, it's not to reverse that scenario entirely. It's already played out. What do you do now given this situation? And that's much of the ethical reasoning within the Old Testament covenant, even amongst what the apostles are working with in the New Testament. The ideals are given in the positive commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But much of the case law, practical outworking of that, comes within cultural limitations. And so just being aware of that fact, rather than treating or judging Scripture as, hey, we're way more moral now than the Bible. Look at how terrible God was in giving these commands in the Old Testament. You think, actually, God is in a just and holy way trying to move the human project forward towards the ideal of the new creation to come. And Jesus is the clearest revelation of what it would look like to be able to express God's love for our Father as with all our being, and our neighbor as ourself. And you just can't feed those Old Testament concerns through the life of Jesus without feeling uncomfortable. And often I'll say to people then, well, your concerns about the Bible, your conscience that you have looking back and saying, hey, something wrong is wrong here, that is such a Christianized conscience. The reason why you're uncomfortable is because the Bible has done its work. Scripture is this spiritual curriculum that helps us wrestle with God, understand his big picture story, what humanity is aiming towards. And it's because of a conscience so shaped by the teaching and influence of Jesus that you're uncomfortable with certain parts of what the Bible says. And that's because the Bible has been successful in shaping you in that way.
One thing I really appreciate about you, I actually watched one of your videos about someone, I didn't know who she was, talking about how Christians always use the Bible to defend what they believe, but who's not to say that the Bible's made up?
Yeah.
They say, oh, it's God ordained and God spoke through me and I wrote it down.
Therefore, they're not willing to critically evaluate their beliefs.
Yeah, correct, right? One thing I really appreciate you and your good friend, who a lot of people will know, Wes Huff, does really well, is explain, well, historically, here's the context. Here's all of the historical texts from 1,000 years around the Bible, and everyone believes these ones that aren't Christian to be true. But apparently there's an issue with the Christian Bible, which are historical texts. And what I think it was Wes was saying yesterday when he was preparing to speak to Joe Rogan, he realized that Joe liked the Mongols. and that the Book of the Mongols was written 600 years after the events had actually happened, whereas most of the, or all of the New Testament was written within 200 years of the events happening. So it's actually far closer to the actual events, if not, as we know with the apostles, they're written within a very short time span of, or eyewitness events.
Well, the New Testament's written within 100 years of the events they describe. But certainly, you're just trying to make these judgments of saying, hey, are there good reasons to take these documents seriously? Because one thing that I'll find critics can often do, and these aren't the informed or really sagely ones, but these are the TikTok-ification kind of critics. It tends to be, hey, well, the Bible is just a book and you shouldn't trust it. And anything in the Bible is obviously biased and propaganda. And like, wait a second. Originally, these just were standalone documents. There was no Bible at the time of Jesus. There was a collection of Jewish writings which they understood to be inspired scripture, and Philo had spoken about that. Certainly the Essene community was gathering them. They had the law and the prophets as these two key categories that they describe even in the ministry of Jesus. Josephus speaks about a list of books. So there's a canon being worked out of Jewish scripture really within the 1st century AD that I think was pretty understood. Certainly Jesus speaks of this scripture category, these covenant writings. But with the New Testament, like, this is just a series of letters that the Apostle Paul had written to various churches or individuals, and a couple of general letters that James and Jude had penned as two half-brothers of Jesus, and church leaders converted after his resurrection, or the Gospels, which I think a case for the traditional authorship is very strong, and most people dismiss it. But I just think, man, look at the reasons why we come there, or the dating of these Gospels. And it really is about saying, well, let's just look at these documents. Who wrote them? When were they written? Are they biased? What's the character of the people writing them? What do they stand to gain or lose if they are misreporting what they are saying? Are there marks of verisimilitude or marks of truthfulness within the writings themselves? Are there other texts or sources historically that can verify key details? Are they got a good track record then of telling the truth? Like, these are things that we can do with these documents.
The other point,
and Christians have accepted them for good reason, because they have stood up to the test that even the critical scholars kind of put out there. And I want to be very honest and say that there are a lot of question marks then that critical scholars will raise about the Gospels or Paul's letters that are really worthy of engagement. As a Christian who's come to believe in Jesus through the historical witness, though, of these documents and experienced God personally, I just don't find that those criticisms really do amount to reasons to abandon the truthfulness of these texts. I think you can make sense of the concerns very reasonably without doing manipulations or underhanded reasoning or non-critical, just blind faith steps. I'm like, no, critically engage, but also I think they stand up to scrutiny and there are good answers.
I think a lot of people and as you said, like TikTok apologists for atheism, don't quite grasp as well, because what a lot of people need to remember is that you need historical context. These are ancient writings. Yes, everyone nowadays can write, and even if you can't write, you have a phone and you can hit dictate and you can talk and it will write it down. That's not what these are, because back then not many people actually had the ability to write, and those who didn't necessarily have the money to buy the papyrus or whatever it was to write on, because that's the other thing. You didn't just go down to your Kmart and buy some reflex paper, right?
Like people don't think about it. It's like $3,000 to $6,000 on today's money to copy one of Paul's letters, depending on how long it was. The shorter ones, obviously less. But you think about that. You're not, as a young church, going to invest that resource unless you see these words are really valuable. And so you would copy it and send it off to another church. But that cost a lot of money. And that's why we have these letters and these Gospels, is because early Christians did recognize the tremendous value that they carry. They did sense the voice of God speaking and the weight of the apostles behind these texts. And so they thought, these are the books that are valuable enough for us to invest that money.
Yeah,
money that otherwise we'd be giving to widows and orphans, but then to be able to send that off to other churches so they too can be built up by the testimony of the apostles. And so, yeah, I mean, that's all part of the story. The ones that survived were the ones that got copied and sent on. The literature that didn't survive, I mean, we know Paul wrote at least 3 letters to the Corinthians, perhaps 4, based on how the internal dialogue goes. But we only have two of them. The other ones were probably just not seen to have as much value for the rest of the church universal, but more specific value to the church there in Corinth.
And I think that's a really important context, because I've certainly come across people that have said, well, anyone can write a letter. Anyone can write to that church and go, hey guys, you guys suck because of blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that's not what was happening. That's not the context of the day. I think it's important to show the weight of why, because I've also heard the argument, well, what about all the letters from other disciples that weren't put into the Bible and that basically disprove Jesus? I'm like, have you read them?
Yeah. Is there one? Sorry. So if you could, sorry. So when people are talking about like the Gnostic Gospels, and we've got videos on our YouTube channel that walk through pretty much all of them. It's like the Gospel of Thomas explained, the Gospel of Judas explained, the Gospel of Mary, or the Infancy Gospel of Thomas explained. And it's the Book of Enoch. We're just trying to help people understand where these texts come from. And we are able to reasonably date many of these, like within a certain kind of dating window. But even more, when we do all those tests I spoke about before, looking at whether the details in the Gospels match the real world of Jesus of Nazareth in the first half of the first century in Galilee and Judea. They just fail all of these tests. They don't include the details, or they get the details wrong of names and places and people and political movements and everything, because they're written by people who weren't there. It doesn't have its source in eyewitness testimony. And so we can do that kind of stuff. It's really not that conspiratorial or hard. But the conspiracy stories just get a lot of airtime because it sounds interesting. And that's why Billy Carson was so big. And you'll even hear Joe Rogan when Wes came on talking about the debate with Billy Carson. He's like, you know what? Everyone knows he was just spouting rubbish, but he was just interesting to listen to. And I think that's the challenge with the kind of entertainment medium that we have, is people just get entertained by conspiracy stories of shadowy institutions deciding which books end up in the Bible. It's like, well, no, there was a pretty easy way of figuring out which books had apostolic weight to them, date back to the first century, or really have touch point with people who knew Jesus. And they're the ones that ended up in the New Testament.
Yeah, they didn't accidentally just stroll into the library and go, these 66 will do. There you go, there's a book. That's not what happened.
And if people are interested, likewise, on our YouTube channel, we've got questions on the canon and how all of that was formed. We've got one coming out in the Apocrypha just in the next couple of weeks, so check that out.
Yeah, definitely shout out as much of your channel as you can, because we want as many people as possible.
Well, we just want people to think through this stuff. And we're trying to be pretty honest, and we say where there's debate amongst Christians, where there's debate amongst the scholarly, critical community, we're not trying to overstate the claims, but just say this is reasonably where we land because we think the weight of evidence points in this direction. But hopefully that is useful content, though, to let people wade into these issues.
Absolutely. Well, let's go a little bit deeper now. So I have mentioned that truth and meaning and purpose is something that I'm hoping that every interview that I do will come to the forefront to help people. Specifically Christianity. Is it possible to live so this is for the non-Christians who might be listening, is it possible to live a good, meaningful, purposeful life without God?
Yeah, great question. I think perceptually, yes. In that, as a person who believes in God, as a person who thinks every human being is made in his image, whether you believe in him or not, your conscience and the reality of creation, if you follow the wisdom of how God has made us, you'll lean into things that matter more, and you'll feel like it matters more. And so that's where you get people saying, look, I think relationships matter, and I want to have a strong marriage. I want to have a strong relationship with my kids. I want to pass on wisdom to the next generation. I want to leave them an inheritance that doesn't just make their lives easier, but makes them better people. I think if you lean into serving humanity and loving and deep and meaningful relationships and building order into the world and framing beauty, of course, you're going to feel like that's meaningful, because it is, because that's the very things that God created us for. So I think they'll have the experience of meaning, even if they're not necessarily able to ground where that comes from. And there's big conceptual ideas here of like an upper story and a lower story of the transcendent and the immanent. And there's a lot of philosophers and theologians that play into that kind of space. Francis Schaeffer from the previous century, and Charles Taylor as a Catholic philosopher and theologian. But I think the challenge is making sense of what grounds that meaning, because as soon as you lean into a godless story, as you say, well, the big picture idea is that we're all here really by accident. and that in the end, we're really just space dust. And people like Brian Cox will say that and put a big smile and a wonderful spin on it. And I love the scientist wonder at nature that they all describe. And we stare out into the universe. It's amazing. I just have this awe and wonder. And I'm like, yes, let that awe and wonder point you to the Creator, because it's meant to be a GPS pointing you home back to the Father's house. But I think if in a godless universe, ultimately life has no purpose. And that's why you'll get those sort of summary statements from the science communicators, the Dawkins of this world. And famously in his book, A River Out of Eden, he said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no meaning, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And you're like, man. Or if you go back 100 years, Bertrand Russell famously spoke about only once we realize that the whole universe is tending towards heat death, or that the cosmic temple of man's achievements is destined to come crashing down, only on this firm foundation of unyielding despair, he says, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. And you're like, that's just such a bleak story. It's like you have space as a vacuum, sucks everything out of a ship. That story sucks meaning, purpose out of a person's life. And it says, no matter how much you feel like your life is meaningful, in the end, you know what? You're going to die. In a generation, you'll be forgotten. The whole universe is destined towards ultimate heat death. Nothing you really do matters. And I think that's the meaninglessness that the secular story alone kind of raises people on. It's like, hey, go and find what makes you happy. But you know what? Your happiness really doesn't matter. And we're going to promise you happiness. But you know what? Really, it's mostly beyond your reach. And I just think that's such a undermining story that if it's not true, and it's a cancer for people to believe, it will just eat you away from the inside. I'd much prefer a story. If Christianity really is true, it's great news, because it does give you all of those same things. You're here for a purpose. You should contribute your gifts to the world. You should work hard. You should frame beauty. You should seek to bring order to the chaos. All of the kind of almost wisdom teacher stuff that Jordan Peterson has been saying for the last decade, but set in a bigger frame. He's like, you kind of need to think that God is real for life to have meaning. And he's realized that connection point. And so, yeah, I think you can feel meaning, but I don't think you can ground meaning. And in the end, the suffering and the experiences of pleasure to the point of saying, well, is that it? Once you've tasted them all and realized that the satisfaction goes away, you end up coming to the point of like great teacher in Ecclesiastes, that Old Testament wisdom literature, who's like, actually everything's meaningless under the sun. He tried wealth and he amassed huge amounts of gold. He tried women. Was it 700 wives and 300 concubines? It's like what do they call it? A roll call or something. The where you're going woman after woman roster, per night. He's like, that's a 3-year roster, and he's like, I've tried everything. He left behind great monuments that would outlast him, Solomon's temple, and he pursued wisdom and the idea of self-mastery and understanding so that others would come and learn at his feet. And yet he's like, if this is all that there is, it's meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And I think that's people's experience too of the secular story. I think of someone like Jim Carrey, who says, I wish everyone got rich and famous and everything they ever dreamed, just to realize that's not the answer. Because that Ecclesiastes uses this cool word in Hebrew, hevel, 37 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And it means smoke or vapor. And we translate it as meaninglessness. But it's something that looks solid, like as a gas form, as a cloud. It looks solid. My kids want me to go up in an airplane to the clouds and grab it when they were little and bring them back a piece. But as soon as you try and take hold of a cloud, it just slips through your fingers. And that's what Solomon, this sort of sagely figure depicted in the book of Ecclesiastes, that's what he says about trying to find meaning in anything under the sun, in the material world. You try to grab hold of it, but it just slips through your fingers.
So for an atheist, or at the very least just someone who's not a Christian, can see what you're saying, and they think, well, gee, that's bleak. I don't want that to be my future, or all there is. But this Christianity thing, this, I don't know if this is for me. You know, how, if I was to jump on board, you know, I come to church and yes, Jesus, I want you in my life. How's my life going to change?
Well, a number of things. If God's real and you genuinely experience him, and this is part of the challenge. Christianity is a system of thought, but it's also a relationship to be experienced. And I think the system of thought in and of itself is great good for the world. I think if Christianity was the lens through which you interpret the world, you can say there's right order, there's right goodness, there's a pattern to follow in the life of Jesus. There's wisdom that the Bible helps me deal with suffering and hardship and struggle. It's got an end goal of who I should be trying to become. It just got the resources to make sense of life. Great. If you had all that without experiencing God, that would still be a great good to you, because you can have answers to the big questions. You can know what you should be aiming for. But if Christianity is true and God's real and you can experience him, and this is the Christian testimony, I don't think many people will become Christian purely convinced by the publicly available evidences. I think God has left testimony to himself. I think the evidence for the resurrection is solid. I love the historical life of Jesus. I think the natural theology arguments for the existence of God are pretty weighty. But atheists like Alex O'Connor will say, look, I've looked at all the evidence. It moves the needle, but I can't just choose to believe. And I think that's because he's missing what so many else in history have described. Blaise Pascal's Night of Fire, or C.S. Lewis's being dragged kicking and screaming into the kingdom of heaven. Just these encounters that people have with the reality of God that changes them. And Jesus describes coming to believe in him as being born again from above by the Spirit. And my experience of becoming a Christian was you feel profound love. And to be known that you are loved unconditionally by your Creator, who sees you to the depths and all the stuff you try and hide from everyone else. He knows it all, and yet he still sees who you are and loves you. That is unbelievably freeing. And when you know that your sins have been forgiven on account of Christ's name and his sacrifice. And so my record now is not held against me. I'm not worried that I'm going to get canceled by God because my sins will be publicly exposed. He has already declared me to be innocent in Christ. Or to know that God's internally moving your desires to help you transform. And he wants us to partner with him to work out our salvation, just like we work out our muscles at the gym. You work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So I just appreciate that the Christian story experientially is rich and satisfying in that way. Knowing God will make you happy, joyful in a way that it's not just based on the material stuff of this world. And it brings you profound peace. Not just the Christian story, hey, gives me good ideas. It's like, no, it's true. Therefore, I am secure in God, this life and in the world to come. And no matter what petrol prices are doing, no matter what wars are brewing, no matter what crazy guys get into politics, you're like, you know what? Actually, we're okay. In God, we're okay. And it just gives you this contentment in whatever situation you find yourself, which is why some of the happiest people in the world are people who have God and nothing else, and have a smile that Westerners will envy when they travel to other parts of the world.
Yeah, that hope is such a wonderful thing. And it's not something that you can explain other than experiencing it. I've had a lot of people that I've spoken to in my workplace, at least, who have said, well, the Bible teaches of all of these things. Christians are supposed to be good and generous, and they list off all these things that they know about Christianity, or think they know. They say, but why do so many Christians fail to be like they're supposed to be? How would you answer that question?
By telling them my story of the last 24 hours. You're right. I think this is probably my biggest bugbear with Christianity, is that I don't think the Bible tells us different or tells us to expect different, but you kind of assume or have this expectation that having a relationship with an omnipotent and omnibenevolent and all-powerful and all-loving God would change you more. That I should have a supernatural quality that is very different than my friends around me who don't believe in God. That I should obviously just shine, kind of like Moses coming down the mountain having seen the glory of God and he has to veil his face. Like, shouldn't that be me? That my Christian friends are like, whoa, our non-Christian friends are a little bit, whoa, he's just too bright. He's kind of blinding. When most of the time they're like, yeah, he's just Dan. Why isn't my life more different? And so I think part of this is recognizing that there's a relational element to us growing up in our salvation. And we should be taught to expect that Christians can behave badly, because every letter in the New Testament was written to correct bad beliefs or bad behaviors of Christians who should have known better and yet weren't following the way of Jesus. Christianity shows us that Jesus composes this incredible score with his life. His whole life is a living sermon. And Christians are invited to learn that score. But for those who are watching can't see, there are instruments dotting this room. My kids are learning to play piano and saxophone and viola, and I love them dearly. But at 11 and 8 and 6, they're not that great yet, right? They're learning how to play the music. They're learning how to participate. And I might say, oh boy, I wish they were way better and that I could hear these great classical pieces played by professionals. In the Christian story, Jesus is the only one that knew how to play it perfectly, and everyone else is still learning, with God's help, how to play along to that score. And what's interesting about Christianity is it's the score itself that exposes the poor performance of the player. Because I know what Johann Sebastian Bach's cello suites should sound like, I can tell when it's not exactly being played to score. And that's what the Bible gives us. In the life of Jesus, we know what it means to love God and love neighbor. And it's the life of Jesus that exposes where Christians fall short. And that's why we pray for daily forgiveness. And it's not until we're delivered from a world plagued with sin and from bodies that have all kinds of temptations and shortcomings and weaknesses that seeing him, we will become like him. And is what theologians call the beatic vision of beholding the full glory of God will so transform our being and our desires that we'll become like Jesus. And until then, we see through a glass dimly, and we're very messy learners along the journey. But I think one thing that encourages me is, as much as you see all the disaster stories of famous leaders and my former boss, being exposed as having a dark double life, I can equally tell the story of many people who have finished well, who have loved their families to the end and been faithful to Jesus. Not as perfect examples, but they do glow. There is a godliness to their being that impresses and moves me, where rather than getting harder or calcifying in the negative aspects of their personality as they get older, they've learned to lean into grace and become softer and more Christ-like. And so I take comfort from those saints who make a lot more progress than I have yet.
For any non-Christian who doesn't understand necessarily how Christianity works, to make it very basic, is if you accept Jesus into your life, we use the term you are born again in Christ. And I've always pictured that as I am now an infant. And as you've just discussed through the musical instrument metaphor, you have to start learning all over again. And we know that children up until, 25 are still molding and changing. And it's the same with Christianity. Whether you have been a Christian all your life or you've come to Christ more recently in your adult life, once that change happens, you're now an infant in all of the things of the Bible. So when you hear someone say, oh, how come Christians fail? It's like, because they're babies and they're trying to learn. And just like a kid who tries to walk will fall, we all make mistakes.
Absolutely.
But what's amazing in Christianity is that God forgives you because he doesn't expect you to be perfect. He wants you to strive to be like Jesus, but knows this is a fallen world, and all he wants is us to come to him and say, I'm so sorry that I stuffed up.
And you see that kind of paradigm too of like the life cycle, where in 1 Peter chapter 2, the Apostle Peter will describe like newborn babes crave pure spiritual milk. And so it speaks of that infancy spiritually. But then in his epistle in 1 John, he describes children, young men, and fathers, sort of the next 3 stages of spiritual development. And so I write to you, children, because you've been forgiven on account of his name. I write to you, young men, because you are strong and overcome the evil one. The word of God abides in you. I write to you, fathers, because you have known him who is from the beginning. And what is characteristic of each stage of spiritual development is kind of where you're up to. As a child, you're forgiven, and you need forgiveness because you're stumbling forward, making mistakes. As a young man, you're making progress and you're growing in strength and you're fighting spiritually. But as an old man, you've just got this abiding knowledge of God. You have known him who is from the beginning. And like Enoch in the Old Testament, you've learned to walk with God. And that's a lifelong journey.
For you personally, what is something that frustrates you or bothers you the most about modern Christianity?
Probably the idea of creating an experience in the moment that crowds out a life of learning to follow Jesus. And so a lot of what people take to be modern Christianity largely will be North American product, what's exported in the sort of evangelical churches of North America, for which I've benefited enormously. Like huge Bible teachers and resources have come out of those spaces that have shaped my spiritual DNA, and I'm thankful for that movement. I would count myself in the historical stream of Christian evangelicalism. But there is a McDonald's-size kind of let's just create the experience and replicate it everywhere, which has reduced Jesus' invitation to come and follow him to an experience on Sunday. And if the experience isn't to my consumer liking, I'll just go somewhere else, rather than learning to follow the way of Jesus and his 50 or so commands and to live in deep, meaningful relationships where we're one anothering. I believe in church leadership. I think the gifts of church leaders with the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, of the responsibility of elders to teach and govern well. And so this isn't a big church thing at all. I'm part of what people might consider a pretty medium-sized, a bigger church. This is just following Jesus is a whole of life thing, and it's measured more in the fruits that it produces in your character and in your deeds than it is in the quality of the experience of a worship service that you might have on a Sunday morning. So yeah, I think that'd be a big part of it. Maybe another one would just be the reduction of the way that people speak about Christian faith as though it's a blind leap in the dark or some spiritual currency or feeling that you have, rather than a trust in God that's evidenced by how you live out every day. I trust to walk by faith, and I've got good reasons. Like right now, my wife's not home. We've got to see her when we started the interview. She's left for the day with a friend. I can't see her. I don't know what she's doing right now. Do I trust her? 100%. Am I concerned that she's off doing something nefarious? Not at all. Now, I don't know that, in the sense of I don't have eyes on her. I don't have a GPS tracking beacon following her location or a private detective relaying everything that she's doing. But it's because of what I know about her. It's the things I do know that shape my trust in what I cannot now see. And it's the same when it comes to God and the Christian story. People think faith is just this decision that you make based out of thin air. It's like, no. It's from a studied knowledge that God is real and how he's acted in the past, how he's faithful to his promises, of his character revealed in Jesus, of his ability to work through darkness to bring about a greater dawn. It's because of what I do know about God in the past that I'm able to trust him for things that I cannot yet answer or things that I cannot yet see. And so maybe that thing that frustrates me is just a wrong concept of faith that ends up robbing people of wrestling with uncertainty and doubt because they need to pretend they don't have those things in order to project some confident spirituality. No, I think there's room for those doubts and questions that we spoke about before.
Okay. So if someone listening is like Alex O'Connor, and they've asked the heavy questions, and maybe they actually want to believe, but they just can't. They can't get to that. We've talked about you can never explain your way into Christianity because it's that opening up of your heart to God, right? What if there's someone who just cannot get that from brain to heart? And when I was a teenager, I was the same. I used to think my way to God. I'm like, it's heart posture. And my brain didn't understand what that meant. Yeah. How do you help someone who says, look, I want to believe what you believe, but I just can't?
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest, I don't think I've got powers of persuasion to change people's mind there. I think it was interesting watching Ayaan Hirsi Ali talk with Richard Dawkins after she was sort of something of a disciple in the New Atheist movement and a voice emerging throughout the European scene, but has recently converted to Christianity and had to explain herself to a former mentor on a public stage who thought, I'm going to be able to talk her out of this. And she's, by the end of it, said you had to confess, I think you really are a Christian. Doesn't like that. Didn't think it's true. But one of the statements she said in there is, I used to think like you. I understand where you're coming from, where you're closed to the transcendent. But for me, I just became open to maybe there's something more. And it's through that openness that led to an experience, an encounter that changed the way that she thinks. For someone like Alex, who has done the research and spent time wrestling with the arguments and going to church and Bible study and relationships with Christians, and my only encouragement in that space, I do think it's going to be an experience of God that will tip the scale. But I do think the intellectual journey is still an important element of that. there is an openness to keep looking at and reevaluating where you stand in the total. Which story makes the most sense? Not is there one knockdown argument that's going to convince me, but in the cumulative sense, which story sheds the most light on reality? And I've just seen in recent days people like Philip Goff or Ian McGilchrist, or even others who I'll leave nameless for private reasons, who are moving because of the arguments, because of where philosophy of mind is going, and just the recognition, actually, I don't think we can ground consciousness in mere matter, that it has to be more primary or fundamental, and that suits better in a theistic framework. And you're like, oh, that's moving people significantly, at least in an intellectual sense, to be open to God, and then they're having spiritual experiences along that journey. So I'd say keep wrestling with the arguments, with the evidence, which story makes the most sense of reality. And I think this is part of what Blaise Pascal did with his whole wager, which is fundamentally misunderstood. I'm thankful to guys like Glenn Scrivener, and I've brought on Doug Grutheis as well, a professor in apologetics and philosophy, to try and help people wrestle this out from Pascal's Pensées. The wager was never meant to tell people to believe in God, because people can't just choose what they believe. It was meant to expose that people who don't continue to seek after God are being irrational. Because if there's at least on balance good reasons to think that God is real, if you're doing that, okay, on this side of the scale is 24 or so arguments for God's existence, some of them reasonably strong, like fine tuning. And then on this side of the scale, you've got things like the revelation problems with the book, the Bible, and violent or slavery or misogyny or those sorts of things, or it's divine hiddenness, or it's the problem of evil, and you're doing the balance between for and against, and you're like, look, I'm still more on the against, but I can recognize there's some pretty good ones on the for, and maybe that could, with experience, tip the balance. You're like, well, look, the reasonable thing, given what's at stake, not just in this life, meaning, purpose, hope, answers, wisdom, but also in the life to come, the potential for eternal life. He does the calculus, and he says, look, if you don't believe in God and you're right or wrong, that has serious ramifications. It's better to tilt towards heaven in this life, to think, if God could be real, I should continue to lean into that. I can't choose to believe, but in my posture, rather than becoming proud and arrogant, and I should review my motives and make sure that I really am seeking. I'm not just seeking to say that I'm seeking for the outsider. I really do want to know. And I'm open to having my perspective changed on the things that are barriers to me believing in God. Maybe there's a bigger picture here than what I'm seeing. I still want to voice my concerns, but I'm not going to hold on to them dogmatically as reasons to hold God at arm's length. But keep investigating and putting yourself in places where God can speak. And God speaks beautifully through Scripture. That's God's word to us. I think he speaks to his church and amongst his people. I think he speaks in creation. And just keep opening yourself up to those means of God making himself known to you would be my advice to someone in that space.
Yeah, if you genuinely want to find God, we know that in Scripture it says, knock and the door will open. Seek me and you will find. I genuinely believe that God is there waiting for everyone. It's really you posturing yourself, positioning yourself where you are able to hear. It's not about, why won't God speak to me? It's like, he wants to.
Yeah.
And I won't go into it now because it'll take too long. But it's actually where I think denominations within Christianity work well. I don't love religiosity because it's a relationship-based belief with Jesus. He welcome you into your life. That's the difference between, it's not a, here's the book, here's the laws, blah. It's like, no, you have a relationship with Jesus and everything else is secondary to that relationship. But the denominations are more for the individual. I believe that they are, where they work well is everyone is different. Humans are beautiful because they are so different from one another. If we were all the same, it'd be boring. And so if you need a beautiful old cathedral and Catholic Mass and the real traditional Orthodox Catholic Christian service to find God, if that's what you need, go there. If you want to go to a big Pentecostal church with rock music and lights and the whole thing and experience God through that, go there. Whatever it is for you to get you to that place, to open up, to find God, that's where you need to be. It's not about, is one better than the other? That's not how it works. There's one Jesus, and there are lots of different ways to find him. It's all dependent on what you need. So that would be my advice, is if you go to a church and you think this is weird, maybe it's just not that one. But don't give up. Try a few others until you find where your place is. You will find it. You just need to keep searching.
I think it's helpful, practical advice.
I finished every episode, because I've taken so much of your time already, with one question, and I don't prepare you for it. Based on everything that you know, everything that you've studied, and everything you're trying to achieve, what makes you hopeful for the future?
Wow. I mean, the biggest thing that I'm hopeful for the future for is that I just think the influence of Jesus and the glory of God are going to continue to fill the earth. It's my hope in who God is and his wisdom seeping into our world that I'm always hopeful in that regard. I think humans can go astray and make a bunch of bad decisions, but I see more and more people waking up maybe to that feeling that something is missing and turning to look for something more. And I think there's a father patiently waiting for the appearance of the prodigal son on the horizon. I think we're in a bit of that prodigal moment, and where I felt a lot of hostility in public Q&As 3 or 4 years ago, I find much more curiosity going on right now, which is just maybe a symptom of what's happening and people turning back to the kind of God stuff. So it's exciting for me, but my ultimate, I guess, hope for the future is anchored in the character of God and his promise to work out his purposes in the world.
Beautiful. It's a great place to leave it. Before we go, anyone who wants to find out more about questioning Christianity, where can they find you? questioningchristianity.com. I know it's a mouthful to have to type out, but questioningchristianity.com, or if you just search on social media at QC Socials is our handle right across all the different platforms at QC Socials, or you can just Google my name or my colleague David Dean, and I'm sure you'll find us. Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll leave it there.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. That's it for us today here on Rule of Reason. Thank you for joining us. I hope you got something out of it, and I will catch you on the very next episode.